Samuel Turner had not spoken to another living soul in 4 months, 3 weeks, and 2 days, and he had counted every single one of them with something that felt disturbingly close to satisfaction. He lived 11 miles east of the town of Cold Fork, Wyoming, in a small cabin he had built himself in the summer of 1882, using timber he had cut from the ridge above the creek and stone he had hauled up from the dry riverbed with nothing but a mule named Cora and a stubbornness that had outlasted 3 Wyoming winters. The cabin had 2 rooms, 1 window, and exactly 1 chair, because Samuel Turner had no intention of entertaining company. The chair was for him. The window was for light. The 2 rooms were because a man needed somewhere to sleep that was separate from somewhere to think, and Samuel did a great deal of thinking. He was 31 years old in the autumn of 1884 when everything changed, though he would not have described it as change at the time. He would have described it as an inconvenience. Later, much later, sitting on a wider porch with a second chair beside his own, he would look back and understand that the word inconvenience had been the first lie he ever told himself about Hester Cooper. It was the 14th of October when he rode into Cold Fork for his monthly supply run. He did not enjoy these trips. He found them necessary and nothing more. The town had expanded in the 3 years since he had settled nearby, growing from a cluster of wind-beaten storefronts into something that considered itself a proper settlement, with a general store, a livery, a church that had finally gotten a real door, and a saloon that had recently acquired a piano player of questionable talent. Samuel moved through the town the way a stone moves through water, displacing as little as possible, making no impression he could help. He tied his horse to the post outside Caldwell's general store and went inside. It was a Tuesday, which was why he chose it. Fewer people on a Tuesday. He had it mapped out in his mind, the precise sequence of his purchases, the way he would exchange the minimum necessary words with old Gerald Caldwell, take his goods, and return to the 11 miles of blissful quiet that awaited him. What he did not have mapped out was the woman standing behind the counter. She was perhaps 26 or 27, with dark hair pinned up in a way that suggested it had started the morning with more ambition than it had managed to maintain, several dark strands having escaped to fall around a face that was striking in its honesty. Her eyes were brown, the particular warm brown of creek water in late summer, and they were currently focused with intense concentration on a ledger that appeared to be causing her considerable grief. "You are not Gerald Caldwell," Samuel said, because he could not think of a better opening and because it was accurate. She looked up. Those Creekwater eyes moved over him with an assessment that was quick but thorough, and she seemed entirely unbothered by his tone. "Gerald Caldwell is my uncle," she said. "He had a fall last week and broke 2 ribs. He is resting. I am minding the store." She looked back down at the ledger. "My name is Hester Cooper, and I have been trying to make this column of numbers agree with itself for the better part of an hour, and so far it is refusing to cooperate, so if you could tell me what you need, I will get it for you, and then I will go back to arguing with arithmetic." Samuel stood just inside the doorway for a moment longer than was comfortable. "Turner," he said. "Samuel Turner, I have a standing account." "I know," Hester said without looking up. 3 months of provisions, consistently the same list, paid in full every time. Your handwriting on the order slip is very neat for a man who lives alone in the wilderness. He did not know what to do with that observation. "I will take the usual order," he said. "I thought you might," she said, and closed the ledger and stood up from the stool, and went about pulling his order from the shelves with an efficiency that impressed him against his will. She knew where everything was. She had only been there a week, and she knew where everything was. He watched her work and told himself he was only watching to make sure she got it right. She got it right. Flour, salt, coffee, dried beans, oats, lamp oil, and 2 boxes of cartridges for a Winchester, she said, setting each item on the counter. "You are missing hardtack from the usual order. Did you finally run out of the patience for it, or do you still want it?" Samuel blinked. How do you know what the usual order is? I read your last 6 order slips, Hester said simply. It seemed like a reasonable way to understand the accounts. You want the hardtack? No, he said after a moment. I do not want the hardtack. Good, she said. I would not want it either. She began wrapping the items in brown paper with quick, competent hands. That will be $2.40. He paid her. She counted back his change with the precision of a woman who had done it many times before. Their fingers did not touch during the exchange because Samuel was careful about that, though he could not have said exactly why he was careful about it that particular day, when he had not been especially careful any other day. He took his parcels and he left, and he rode the 11 miles home, and he put his provisions away, and he sat in his single chair and looked out his single window at the last pale gold of the October afternoon, and he thought, for no reason he could account for, about the way she had said the word arithmetic, like it was a living thing that had personally offended her. He did not go back to Cold Fork for 6 weeks. 6 weeks was longer than his usual month, and the consequence of this decision was that he ran out of coffee on the 38th day and spent the following 3 days in a state of grim deprivation that he deserved entirely. On the 43rd day, he ran out of lamp oil, and that was when he admitted to himself that he had been avoiding the general store, and that this avoidance had a specific and inconvenient reason, and he saddled his horse before he could think about it any longer. It was the first week of December. The cold had come properly now, settling over the Wyoming landscape with a permanence that turned the creek behind his cabin to a narrow ribbon of dark water between white banks. The ride into Cold Fork was not pleasant. By the time he arrived, the wind had found every gap in his coat and made itself at home there. The general store was warm. Gerald Caldwell was behind the counter, moving with the careful rigidity of a man whose ribs had healed but whose pride in the matter had not, and he greeted Samuel with the familiar nod of a man who respected another man's preference for brevity. Samuel experienced something he was not proud of, which was a distinct and immediate drop in his mood. He gathered his supplies, he paid. He was almost at the door when Gerald said, "Hester has been asking after you." Samuel stopped. He turned around slowly. "I beg your pardon." Gerald looked like a man who was enjoying himself. "My niece. She came to me with a business question. Wanted to know if you had come in on account of there being a discrepancy in the account ledger she found. Something about the coffee pricing from 3 years back. Said she tried to work it out but needed to ask you about it personally." Samuel stood very still. "A discrepancy in the ledger. That is what she said." "Where is she?" Gerald's enjoyment became more visible. "She is staying at the Tanner boarding house just down the post road. She has been helping out there since her uncle took ill. She works the mornings here and the afternoons there, keeping their books and helping with the mending." He paused. "She is a very capable woman, my niece." "I am sure she is," Samuel said, in a voice that committed to nothing. He told himself he was going to the boarding house because of the ledger discrepancy. He told himself this with great conviction as he walked down the post road with his hands in his coat pockets and the cold wind pushing against him. A man had a right to know if his accounts were in order. That was not curiosity. That was practical business sense. The Tanner boarding house was a 2-story wood frame building that had seen better decades but maintained a kind of dignity in its decline, its porch swept clean and a wreath of dried sage on the front door. Samuel knocked, and a woman of middle age with flour on her apron answered and told him Hester was in the back parlor mending, and that he could go in if he had business. He had business. Hester was sitting near the window with a pile of clothing in her lap and a needle in her hand, and she looked up when he appeared in the doorway with an expression that was not surprise. As if she had expected or at least not been unprepared for the possibility of him. "Mr. Turner," she said, "you finally came back." "Your uncle said there was a discrepancy in my account," Samuel said. Hester set down her mending and folded her hands in her lap and looked at him with those steady brown eyes. "There is no discrepancy in your account," she said. "Your account is perfectly in order." I told my uncle that because I suspected he would not pass along a simple message asking you to come in, and I was right. Samuel stared at her. You fabricated a business matter. I did, she agreed, without a flicker of remorse. Because you disappeared for 6 weeks and I wanted to know if the hardtack thing had offended you somehow. He opened his mouth. He closed it. He tried again. The hardtack thing. When I said I would not want it either, Hester said. I worried afterward that it might have seemed presumptuous, like I was commenting on your provisioning choices when you had not asked for my opinion. Samuel stood in the doorway of the back parlor of the Tanner boarding house in the first week of December, 1884, and he looked at this woman who had invented a fake account discrepancy because she had been wondering for 6 weeks whether she had inadvertently offended him with an observation about hardtack, and something in his chest moved in a way that he had not been expecting and was not prepared for. It did not offend me, he said. Good, Hester said. And then she picked up her mending again and said, Sit down, Mr. Turner. It is cold out and you look half frozen, and I have been alone in this parlor for 2 hours, and I could use something to talk at, even if it does not talk back much. He sat down. The chair he sat in was placed across from hers, near the window, and through the glass he could see the pale winter light falling on the empty street of Cold Fork, and it occurred to him that he had been in hundreds of rooms in his life, and this was the first time since he was a young man that sitting in one felt like something other than waiting to leave. He did talk back, as it turned out. Not much at first. She did most of the talking, which he discovered was something she did naturally, without artifice, the way some people breathe, simply because she had things to say and saw no reason not to say them. She talked about the ledger and the way the numbers had been kept, and about the challenges of arriving in a new town and trying to find one's footing, and about how Cold Fork was smaller than she had expected and colder than she had been told. He listened. He had always been a good listener, not because he was particularly generous, but because he was economical with his own words, and had learned that silence was often the most useful thing he could offer. But listening to Hester Cooper was different from his usual quality of listening, which tended toward the polite and the patient. Listening to her was the kind of listening where you found yourself leaning forward without meaning to. She told him she had come from a small town in Kansas, a place called Birch Hollow, where she had spent 3 years keeping the books for her father's mercantile, and 2 more years after his death managing the whole business herself before the bank had called in a debt she had not known existed. Her father, she said, had been a warm and generous man with very poor financial instincts, and she had loved him entirely and inherited the mess without complaint. And when it was all settled and the mercantile was gone, she had come west to her uncle's store because there was nothing left in Birch Hollow that required her presence. She said all of this without self-pity, which Samuel noticed, because self-pity was a thing he had learned to be alert to in people, having had a great deal of experience with his own. There was a particular flavor of grief in Hester's account that was simply matter of fact, the way she talked about her father's debt and the loss of the store and the leaving of the only town she had ever called home, and it made him feel something he had not expected to feel in the back parlor of a boarding house, which was a profound and uncomfortable recognition. He did not tell her his own story that afternoon. He was not ready for that. He told her he had built his cabin alone and that he preferred it, and she nodded at this as if it were an entirely reasonable thing for a person to prefer. I understand that, she said. After a certain kind of loss, the quiet can feel like the only reliable thing. He looked at her sharply. I did not say anything about a loss. No, she agreed. You did not. And she left it there, which was one of the more remarkable things she could have done. He left the boarding house an hour later with the uncomfortable feeling that he had said less than he wanted to, which was something he had never experienced before, because the usual situation was that he said exactly as much as he wanted to, which was not very much at all. He went back 2 weeks later. He told himself it was for supplies. He bought supplies at the general store, and then he walked to the boarding house and knocked on the door, and Mrs. Tanner let him in with a look that suggested she had been expecting him, which irritated him slightly but not enough to make him leave. Hester was in the parlor again, not mending this time but reading, a book open in her lap that she marked with a scrap of paper before she set it aside. She did not look surprised to see him. She did not look unsurprised either. She simply looked at him the way she tended to look at him, which was with a directness that he had stopped finding unsettling and started finding, against all his better judgment, like something he wanted aimed at him. "Mr. Turner," she said, "you are on time. I did not know we had an appointment." "We did not," she said, "but I had a feeling you would come today, so I sat in the parlor instead of the kitchen." She gestured to the other chair. "Sit down." He sat down. December had deepened outside the window, and the light came at a low angle that made the whole room feel amber and enclosed like the inside of something warm. "Tell me about your cabin," Hester said. He talked about the cabin. He had not talked about the cabin to anyone, not because it was a secret, but because there had been no one to tell. He found that he had more to say about it than he had realized. He told her about the location, the way the ridge came up behind it and created a windbreak in winter, the way the creek below it ran clean and cold year-round. He told her about the way he had fitted the window so that it caught the morning light from the east, and how in summer the valley below turned a shade of green that did not seem real, too saturated, too vivid, like something out of a painting made by a person who had never learned restraint. Hester listened the way he listened to her, with the quality of attention that made the speaking feel worth doing. "You love it," she said when he had finished. "I find it sufficient," Samuel said. Hester gave him a look that said she knew the difference between those two things and was choosing not to argue with him about it, which was its own kind of argument, and he found it enormously irritating, and also something he could not stop thinking about later that night when he was back in his cabin in his single chair. The weeks progressed. He came to town on a schedule that had stopped pretending to be about provisions. He would go to the general store, because that was where the provisions were, and because Gerald Caldwell had ceased pretending not to notice, and then he would go to the boarding house, and he would sit in the chair that had begun to feel like his chair across from the chair that was definitely hers, and they would talk. The talking changed over time. It deepened the way a river deepens as it gets further from its source, becoming slower on the surface but carrying more underneath. She told him about Birch Hollow and her childhood, and the way her mother had died when Hester was 11 years old, a fever that had come and gone in 3 days and taken everything with it, and how her father had grieved himself into a kind of permanently distracted love, warm and present, and entirely unable to manage the practical details of his own life. She had managed them for him. She had been managing practical details for other people since she was 12 years old, and she was good at it, though she thought it would be nice someday to have someone manage a practical detail for her just once. She said that last part lightly, as if it were a joke, but Samuel heard what was underneath it, and he filed it away in the place where he kept the things that mattered. He told her in late January about Clara. He had not planned to. They had been talking about something else entirely, the hard winter of 1882 and the cattle losses throughout the territory, and somehow it had come out sideways, the way the most important things tend to come out, not through a door but through a window you did not know you had left open. Clara had been his wife. They had married in Missouri in 1878, when Samuel was 24 and Clara was 22, and the world had seemed like something that was going to cooperate with them. They had come west in 1879 with plans and a good mule and the kind of optimism that the frontier either forged into something harder or broke entirely. The fever had taken Clara in the summer of 1880, not long after she had told him she was expecting their first child, and it had taken the child too, the child who had not yet been born, the child who had only existed in the space of possibility and hope. Samuel had buried his wife on a hillside in eastern Wyoming, and he had spent a year afterward being a man whose grief was indistinguishable from a decision. And eventually the decision had hardened into a way of life, and the way of life had hardened into a preference, and the preference had hardened into something that felt, if you did not look at it too closely, like contentment. He told Hester this in the amber parlor light of a January evening, and when he was done there was a silence that was not uncomfortable. Hester did not offer him sympathy, which he had always found unbearable in its condescension, and she did not tell him he would find happiness again, which was worse. She simply sat with it the way she sat with everything, with a steadiness that felt less like patience and more like respect. "How long ago?" she said at last. 4.5 years. "And the cabin," she said, "you built it the summer after." "Yes." She was quiet for another moment. Then, did it help? He considered the question honestly, the way she seemed to expect him to consider things. "It helped me stop feeling like I was failing at something," he said. "When you are among people and you are grieving, you feel constantly as if you are doing it wrong, as if you should be getting better faster, or managing better, or wanting different things than you want. The cabin stopped that. Out there I am only accountable to myself." Hester nodded slowly. "And now," she said, "now what? Are you still grieving?" He opened his mouth to say yes, because that was the word he had been using inside his own mind for 4.5 years. But he found, in this particular moment, sitting across from Hester Cooper in the lamplight of the Tanner boarding house, that the word no longer fit precisely. That what he had been doing for the last 4.5 years was not exactly grief anymore, but had become something else, a habit of solitude, a practiced withdrawal that he had grown so comfortable with that he had stopped distinguishing it from a genuine need. "I do not know," he said, which was the most honest thing he had said to anyone in 4.5 years. Hester looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up her book and opened it to her marked page, not dismissively, but with the ease of someone who understood that a man needed room after a thing like that, and she read quietly. And he sat in his chair across from her, and the fire burned in the hearth, and the winter wind moved past the window outside, and neither of them said anything else for a while. It was, Samuel thought on the ride home, the most peaceable evening he had spent in the company of another person in living memory. February arrived with a ferocity that even seasoned Wyoming residents regarded with irritation. The storms came in rapid succession, 3 of them in the first 2 weeks, each one depositing another layer of snow on the landscape, until the world was simplified to white and gray and the dark lines of fence posts and tree branches. Travel between Caldwell's general store and Samuel's cabin became, for a stretch of nearly 2 weeks, impractical. He had prepared for this. He had sufficient provisions. He was fine. He was absolutely fine. He sat in his single chair for 5 days and read, and tended his horse and cut wood and told himself he was fine. And on the 6th day he found himself standing at the window of his cabin looking south toward Cold Fork with an expression on his face that, had anyone been there to observe it, would have required no interpretation whatsoever. He was not fine. He waited 3 more days out of what he recognized was stubbornness, and then he saddled his horse and made the 11 miles through knee-deep snow with a determination that was almost aggressive. The horse, a steady gray gelding named Ash, appeared to find the whole thing unremarkable and moved through the drifts with patient competence. Cold Fork was half buried and largely empty when he arrived. Most sensible people were inside. Samuel went to the boarding house because that was where he was going and knocked, and Mrs. Tanner opened the door and said, "Mr. Turner, you are a determined man," and let him in. Hester was in the kitchen this time, not the parlor, sitting at the kitchen table with both hands wrapped around a coffee cup and a look on her face that transformed when she saw him into something she was quick to arrange back into composure, but not quick enough. She had been glad to see him. He had seen it, that immediate involuntary light. "You rode through all of this," she said, making a gesture toward the window and the white world beyond. "The horse needed the exercise," Samuel said. Hester looked at him with eyes that communicated clearly that she did not believe him even slightly. "Sit down," she said, "and I will get you a coffee, and you will tell me why you really rode 11 miles through a blizzard." He sat down at the kitchen table instead of the parlor, and Mrs. Tanner removed herself tactfully, and Hester poured a second cup of coffee and set it in front of him and sat back down across from him, and he held the warm cup in his cold hands and looked at it for a moment. "I wanted to make sure you were all right," he said, "with the storms." It was true, he realized as he said it. It was also not the whole truth, but it was the part he could offer without the thing under it becoming visible. Hester seemed to understand this. She nodded, as if it were the most natural thing in the world for a man who had been perfectly solitary for 4.5 years to ride 11 miles through a winter storm to check on an acquaintance. "I am all right," she said. "My uncle's ribs are troubling him in the cold, and Mrs. Tanner's roof has a leak above the east bedroom, but we are managing." "What does the roof need?" she told him. He spent 2 hours on the Tanner boarding house roof in conditions that could charitably be described as unpleasant, finding the gap in the shingles and sealing it with the pitch and spare shingles he located in Mrs. Tanner's outbuilding. When he came down, Hester met him at the back door with a towel and an expression he could not entirely read, except that it was warm. "You did not have to do that," she said. "Someone had to," Samuel said. "Mrs. Tanner has a nephew in town." "Mrs. Tanner's nephew," Samuel said, taking the towel, "has not been to see about her roof." Hester was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "No, he has not. He stayed for supper. Mrs. Tanner was a good cook and seemed genuinely pleased to have him at her table, and the meal was the kind of warm, loud, ordinary domestic thing that Samuel had been successfully avoiding for years and found, now that he was in the middle of it, not nearly as suffocating as he had expected. There were 2 other boarders, a schoolteacher named Mr. Potts who was excitable about geography, and a young widow named Mrs. Alcott who was waiting for a land claim to clear, and they talked about the storms and the spring planting prospects, and whether the new territorial government was going to be worth anything. And Samuel contributed occasional observations and drank 2 cups of coffee and ate 3 helpings of beef stew, and did not once feel the urge to leave. He rode home in the dark under a sky that had cleared to an improbable field of stars, and ash moved steadily through the snow, and Samuel looked up at the stars and felt, for the first time in a long time, something he did not have an immediate word for. He found the word later in the dark of his cabin. It was something close to wanting. Not the wanting that was shaped like grief, hollow and aching, a different kind. The wanting that was shaped like a door with something good on the other side. He did not know what to do with it, but he could not pretend it was not there. The spring came slowly and then all at once, the way Wyoming springs did, the snow retreating in patches, the creek rising with melt, the valley below his cabin going through its successive transformations of brown and gold and green, until it arrived at that saturated, impossible green he had told Hester about in the November parlor light. He had been describing it then, and she had said she would like to see it sometime, and he had said it was worth seeing, and neither of them had said anything more about it. But he had thought about it through the winter months, the hypothetical of Hester Cooper standing in the valley below his cabin and seeing the green he had always kept for himself. March arrived, and then April, and his visits to Cold Fork had settled into a rhythm that the entire town seemed to have noticed and formed opinions about. Gerald Caldwell had begun giving him a knowing look when he came in for supplies. The schoolteacher, Mr. Potts, who remained at the boarding house through the winter, greeted Samuel with an air of cheerful conspiracy whenever he arrived. Even Mrs. Tanner had started setting an extra place at her kitchen table on the days he tended to arrive. Samuel found all of this acutely uncomfortable and continued coming anyway. In April, Gerald Caldwell's ribs healed fully enough for him to consider resuming full management of the store, which created a question that no one stated directly, but that everyone, including Samuel, was aware of. What would Hester do now? He arrived on a Thursday in mid-April to find her at the counter of the general store with the ledger open and a very particular expression on her face, which was the expression of a person making calculations that involved more than numbers. "Gerald is coming back next week," she said without preamble when he came in. "I know," Samuel said. He put his hands in his coat pockets and stood on his side of the counter. "What will you do?" She looked down at the ledger and then back up at him. "Mrs. Tanner has offered me a permanent position managing her household accounts and helping with the running of the boarding house. It is not the same as having my own business, but it is honest work and a roof over my head, and Cold Fork is as good a place as any." "Is it a place you want to stay?" he asked. He was aware that his voice was doing something he had not given it permission to do, which was carrying an inflection that made the question more than casual. Hester was quiet for a moment. Outside, the April wind moved down the main street of Cold Fork, stirring the dust that had come back with the spring thaw. The bell above the store door swayed without ringing. "There are reasons to stay," she said carefully, "and I have no pressing reasons to go." Samuel Turner stood very still behind the counter and looked at Hester Cooper and understood, with a clarity that felt like a physical sensation, that the moment required something from him. That it had been requiring something from him for months, and that he had been providing a very reasonable and well-constructed approximation of it. The visits, the roof repair, the supper at Mrs. Tanner's table, but that the actual thing, the thing that the moment required, was still waiting. "The valley below my cabin," he said, "is green this week, like I described to you." Hester looked at him with those clear brown eyes. "I would like you to see it," he said, "if you would like to." It was not a declaration. He was not ready for a declaration. But it was something honest, and honest was where he had to start. Hester's mouth curved, not a smile exactly, but the cousin of one, something quieter and more certain. "I would like to," she said. They rode out on a Saturday, the weather holding clear and cold in the morning and warming by midday into something that was almost generous. Samuel had spent 2 days before the visit doing things he was not willing to examine too closely, which included sweeping out the cabin, acquiring a second chair from the joiner in town, at a price that confirmed the joiner had entirely too accurate a sense of the situation, and cutting flowers, or what passed for them this early in a Wyoming spring, the first brave clumps of blue wildflowers that came up along the creek bank before anything else had the nerve. He had put the flowers in a tin cup on the windowsill, and then stood back and looked at them, and felt acutely ridiculous, and left them there anyway. Hester rode beside him on a brown mare she borrowed from the livery, and she was not a tentative rider, which he had somehow guessed. She sat the horse with the ease of someone who had grown up around them, and she rode with her head up and her eyes moving over the landscape the way his did, taking it in, reading it. They talked easily on the ride out the way they had learned to talk through the winter months, with the particular comfortable fluency of two people who have discovered that they can share silence and conversation in equal measure without either one feeling like a failure. When the cabin came into view and the valley spread below it, Hester went quiet. Samuel watched her face as she took it in, the extraordinary green of the new grass in the valley floor, the silver thread of the creek, the dark line of the ridge against the blue sky, and he felt something tighten in his chest that was not unpleasant. "You undersold it," she said. "I described it accurately. You said it was like a painting made by someone without restraint." She looked at him. "It is not like a painting. A painting is a dead thing trying to look alive. This is alive." He did not have an answer for that. He was finding more and more often that Hester left him without adequate answers, and he was finding this less uncomfortable than he would have predicted. They ate the lunch he had prepared, sitting on the flat rock above the creek where he had eaten hundreds of solitary lunches, and the presence of another person there did not ruin it the way he had always vaguely feared that the presence of another person would ruin all the things he had made his own. It changed them, but the change was not subtraction. It was something more like addition, a second dimension to the experience that he had not known was missing, because he had spent 4.5 years not comparing. After lunch she asked to see the cabin, and he showed her, briefly, the 2 rooms and the single window and the place where he had put the second chair, which she noticed with a look that she kept carefully composed. She looked at the wildflowers in the tin cup for a moment without saying anything. "They grow along the creek bank," Samuel said, which was an explanation for nothing in particular. "They are beautiful," Hester said, and there was something in her voice that he heard clearly, that she knew he had put them there, and she was telling him without embarrassment that it mattered to her. They rode back to Cold Fork in the late afternoon, the sun dropping behind the western hills, the sky going through its changes of gold and copper and deep rose, and Samuel found himself calculating the distance between his cabin and Mrs. Tanner's boarding house, not in miles but in something less measurable, and arriving at a conclusion that he was not going to deny any more. On the steps of the boarding house, Hester dismounted and turned to hand him the reins of the livery mare, and when he took them their hands were close enough that the warmth of her fingers was a fact he registered precisely. "Thank you," she said, "for showing me." "It is yours to see whenever you want to," Samuel said, and then heard what he had said and could not take it back and did not want to. Hester looked at him for a moment with those steady eyes, and then she said, "Good night, Mr. Turner," and went inside, and Samuel stood on the post road in the last light of an April evening with both horses and a feeling in his chest like something that had been shut for a long time and was considering the possibility of opening. He was not a man who moved quickly. He had established this as a fact about himself, and he did not apologize for it. But the spring moved around him with its own momentum, the days lengthening, the valley deepening into its full green, the town of Cold Fork acquiring the seasonal energy of a place that had survived another winter and was prepared to reward itself. Hester had taken the position at the boarding house and was, by all accounts, extraordinarily good at it. She had also, Samuel discovered, begun keeping books for 2 other Cold Fork businesses whose owners had heard from Gerald about the quality of her arithmetic, and she had quietly established herself as a person of competence and reliability in a town that valued these qualities above almost all others. He admired this. He admired it in the way that a person admires a thing that confirms something they already believed, because he had known from the first day in the general store that Hester Cooper was someone who understood that work done well was its own argument. In May, there was a trouble with a man named Deck Harlow. Deck Harlow was not from Cold Fork but had come through in late April and stayed, the way certain men stayed in certain towns, drifting into the edges of things and finding small ways to make themselves unpleasant. He was perhaps 40 and carried himself with the aggressive ease of a man who has learned that his size and his willingness to use it are enough to get him most of what he wants. He had taken an interest in Hester, which was the kind of interest that did not ask permission and did not take the absence of encouragement for an answer. Samuel became aware of this through Gerald Caldwell, who mentioned it with studied casualness and watchful eyes, and then through Hester herself, who told him about it with the matter-of-fact tone she used for unpleasant things that she was managing. "He comes into the store," she said. "He is not violent. He is simply persistent in a way that I find exhausting." "Has he threatened you?" "Not explicitly." She paused. "He is the kind of man who makes his meaning clear without needing to say it outright." Samuel knew the type. He had spent enough years in difficult places to know the type. He sat with this information for a moment and then said, with a quietness that had nothing relaxed in it, "Would it be useful if I were in the store when he comes in?" Hester looked at him. "You do not need to do that." "I know I do not need to," Samuel said. "Would it be useful?" She was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said, "I think it would." He made a point of being at the general store on the days she worked it. He did not make a production of this. He simply came and sat near the window with a coffee and talked with Gerald and was present. Deck Harlow came in twice during this period, and both times took one look at Samuel's expression and conducted his business with a brevity that suggested he had performed an accurate assessment of the situation. The second time, he did not come back. Hester thanked Samuel for it in the spare, direct way she thanked him for things, which was without excess and without minimization, and then she said, "You have never told me why you choose to live alone." It was an afternoon in late May, and they were sitting on the boarding house porch in the last warm light, which was a new development, the porch, the sitting outside together, a natural progression of the parlor winter into the porch spring. He had a coffee, she had a glass of water. The town moved quietly past on the street before them. "I told you about Clara," he said. "You told me about losing her," Hester said. "That is a reason to grieve, but you have been alone for 4.5 years. That is a choice." He was quiet for a moment. "After she died," he said, "I tried for a while to keep living the way we had been living, among people in a town, going to church, eating meals with neighbors, and I found that I could not do it without feeling a kind of rage that frightened me. Not at any person in particular, just at the fact that everything kept going, that the world kept being ordinary while I was carrying something that felt anything but ordinary." Hester listened without interrupting. "The cabin was supposed to be temporary," he said, "somewhere to get through the worst of it. But I stayed, and the staying became a habit, and the habit became something I was good at, and I started to confuse being good at something with it being right for me. And now," she said, the same question she had asked in January. "Now," Samuel said, and then stopped. He looked out at the post road and the storefronts of Cold Fork and the ordinary life of a Wednesday afternoon in a small Wyoming town in the spring of 1885. He looked at all of it, and then he looked at Hester, who was looking at him with the patient attention of someone who was not going to fill the silence for him. "Now it feels like a waste," he said. "The alone. It used to feel like the right shape for my life. Now it feels like something I have been doing out of habit, and the habit was supposed to protect me from something, but I am starting to forget what it was." Hester set her glass of water down on the porch rail very carefully. "Samuel," she said, and it was the first time she had used his first name, and the sound of it was different from his full name, shorter, more direct, like a hand placed on a shoulder. "Yes," he said. "I have been in Cold Fork for 8 months," she said. "I arrived with one bag and a situation I was making the best of, and no particular expectations about what I would find here. And what I found was a town that is not remarkable except for one thing." She paused. "And that thing rides out 11 miles in a blizzard to check on a roof." Samuel looked at her. "I am not going to tell you what to do," Hester said. "I have been managing things for other people since I was 12 years old, and I have no desire to manage this. But I want you to know that the alone you are so committed to feels, from where I am sitting, like a very good thing that is being wasted." She picked up her water glass. "And I find I cannot argue with a waste. It offends me." The silence that followed this was of the particular quality that precedes important things, like the air before a storm or the moment before a song begins, and Samuel Turner sat in it and felt the last resistance in him, the resistance he had been maintaining for 4.5 years and repairing every morning like a fence after a hard winter, give way. Not collapse, give way. There was a difference. Collapse was something that happened to you. Giving way was something you chose. "Hester," he said. "Yes." "I would like to court you," he said, "if you would allow it properly. I would like to speak with Gerald because he is your family here, and I would like us to have the time we need, and I would not rush you or ask more than you are willing to give. But I want you to know that this is what I am asking." Hester looked at him for a long moment, and in the warm, late afternoon light, her face had the particular stillness of a person who is feeling something too large for their usual expression to contain. Then she said, "I thought you were never going to say it." "I am not a fast-moving man," Samuel said. "No," she said. "You are not, but you are a thorough one, and I find I prefer that." A pause. "Yes, Samuel, you may court me." He went to see Gerald Caldwell the following morning. Gerald received him in the back room of the store with a cup of coffee and the look of a man who had been preparing for this conversation for several months. He asked Samuel his intentions, which Samuel stated clearly, and he asked about his means, which were modest but sufficient, and then he sat back and said, "You are a good man, Turner. She deserves a good man. Do not make her wait too long." Samuel promised he would not. The summer of 1885 in Cold Fork, Wyoming, was the summer that Samuel Turner discovered that courtship, done right, was its own kind of happiness. He had forgotten this, or perhaps never fully known it, because his courtship of Clara had been in Missouri, in a town full of people he had grown up with, a courtship that had been shaped by familiarity and proximity, and the kind of comfortable affection that comes from having known someone most of your life. This was different. This was the courtship of two people who had come from elsewhere, who had found each other in a place neither of them had expected to be, who were both, in their different ways, starting over. There was a clarity to it that he had not anticipated, a sense of choosing rather than arriving, of this being something deliberate and known rather than merely the natural progression of a life. He took her riding on Saturday afternoons when the weather held. He brought her things he thought she would like, not gifts of jewelry or ribbon, but things chosen with her specifically in mind. A particular kind of pen nib she had mentioned needing for her bookwork. A small illustrated volume about the natural history of the Wyoming territory that he had found in the back of the general store, and suspected she would read from cover to cover. She received these things with a warmth that was never performative, always genuine, always accompanied by that direct look that made him feel seen in a way he had been avoiding for years. She came to the cabin again, several times, and each time the second chair was there, and she sat in it. And the cabin, which had been engineered for one, accommodated two with a naturalness that he had not expected. She brought order where he had let things slide into comfortable disorder. Not because she could not tolerate disorder, but because she noticed things that needed doing and her hands went to them automatically. He found this not intrusive but companionable, a presence in the space that changed the quality of the air. He began to see his cabin differently through these visits. The single window that he had placed for morning light was also, he saw now, a window that in the afternoon caught the west-facing glow and made the interior of the cabin warm and golden. He had never needed to see this because he had never been in the cabin in the late afternoon with someone else. Alone, you see only what you need. Together, you see more. In August, he asked her to marry him. He had not planned a speech. He had thought about a speech, several versions of it, and discarded them all as insufficient. What he had instead was the truth, which he had found was the only currency that worked between them. They were sitting on the flat rock above the creek behind his cabin, the same rock where they had eaten lunch in April, and the creek was summer-low and clear over its stones, and the late afternoon was warm with the particular lazy warmth of a Wyoming August that knows itself to be temporary. "Hester," he said. She turned from the creek to look at him. "I built this cabin alone because I thought that was what I needed," he said. "I have lived in it alone for 3 years and I have found it sufficient, and I was good at it, and I told myself that good and sufficient were enough." He paused. "They are not enough. They have not been enough for some time, but I was not willing to know that until I had something to compare it to." He reached into his coat pocket and brought out a small ring, plain gold with a small inset of dark red stone, which had belonged to his grandmother, and which he had been carrying for 2 weeks trying to find the right moment. "I want to compare everything to you for the rest of my life. That is the most honest thing I can tell you." Hester looked at the ring in his hand and then at his face, and something moved in her expression that he recognized as the thing she worked hardest to contain, the depth of feeling she kept carefully managed, which he understood because he had done the same thing for years. "Samuel Turner," she said, "you are the most circuitous man I have ever met, and I am completely certain you are the right one." She held out her hand. "Yes." He put the ring on her finger and she looked at it in the afternoon light and then looked at him, and he kissed her for the first time, there on the flat rock above the creek, the summer air warm and the water moving below them, and it was the kind of kiss that was also a permission, a mutual releasing of something held back for too long. They were married in October of 1885, 1 year after Hester had first come to Cold Fork. The wedding was at the church that had finally gotten a real door, which seemed appropriate, and Gerald Caldwell walked her down the aisle with a pride that was unmistakable, and Mrs. Tanner cried in the second pew, and Mr. Potts, the schoolteacher, shook Samuel's hand with an enthusiasm that left his fingers slightly numb. Samuel had built a second room onto the cabin over the summer, because 2 rooms and 1 window were no longer adequate. The new room had 2 windows. Hester had chosen their placement. The winter of 1885 and 1886 was the winter Samuel Turner learned what it was to be warm in his own home in a way that had nothing to do with the fire in the hearth. It was the warmth of shared mornings, of coffee made by someone who knew how you took it without needing to be reminded, of conversations that began before you were fully awake and resumed in the evening, as if they had never stopped because, in a sense, they had not. It was the warmth of a second body in a house that had been built for one and had expanded, room by room and in other less architectural ways, to accommodate 2. Hester brought herself completely to the life of the cabin, which was to say she brought her intelligence and her practicality and her particular gift for seeing what needed doing and doing it, but also her humor, which was dry and precise, and arrived at unexpected moments in a way that consistently delighted him. She also brought her books, which filled the shelf he built for them, and then the second shelf, and were beginning to negotiate with the third wall. He had not been a great reader, but he found, that winter, that he was willing to become one if she would read to him in the evenings, which she did, her voice steady and expressive in the lamplight while the snow accumulated outside. He told her things he had not told anyone, not just about Clara, which he had told her in fragments over the course of the courtship, but about the years before, about Missouri and the farm he had grown up on, and his father who had been a hard man in the way that men of that generation and circumstance were hard, not cruel but compressed, as if the weight of his life had pressed him into a smaller and more angular shape. Samuel had spent a long time being afraid of becoming his father's kind of hard. The alone had been, in part, a way of ensuring that no one could be hurt by whatever hardness he might carry. Hester listened to all of this and then said, with the directness that was one of the things he loved most about her, "You are not your father. You are a man who built a cabin with a window facing east so it would have good morning light. That is not the choice of a hard man." He did not have an answer for that. He held her instead, which was its own kind of answer. In the spring of 1886, Hester told him she was expecting their first child. She told him on a morning in April, over coffee, with the matter-of-fact steadiness she brought to important things, and he sat very still for a moment and felt the weight of the knowledge settle into him. Not the weight of fear, though the fear was there, quiet and present, the memory of what had been lost before coloring the edge of this. But under the fear was something larger, something that expanded rather than contracted, something that felt like what the valley looked like in the spring, that impossible, excessive, unreserved green. He reached across the kitchen table and took her hand. "Are you all right?" he said. "I am very well," she said. "I feel quite certain about all of it." He believed her, which was one of the qualities of Hester that he was still discovering, that she was not the kind of person who said she felt certain about something she was not certain about. She told you when she was afraid, and she told you when she was uncertain, and so when she told you she felt certain you could bank on it. He was afraid. He told her so, simply and directly, the way she had taught him to tell the truth about the things that were hardest. She listened and held his hand and said she understood, and then she said that she was not going to let the past take this from them, and he thought that was exactly right, and they sat at the kitchen table in the April morning with the new light coming through the east-facing window, and let the certainty settle in alongside the fear, the two of them occupying the same space without canceling each other out. The summer was full. Hester remained well through it, energetic in her characteristic way, but also quieter in the evenings, given to sitting on the porch in the long summer light with her hands still in her lap, and a look on her face that Samuel had come to recognize as the look of a person who was becoming more and more present in their own life. He built a porch railing that summer, on the theory that the porch needed one, and added a step to the front and put in a proper kitchen floor where the packed dirt had been, and was working on a small addition to the bedroom when the summer deepened into August. Gerald Caldwell came out to the cabin on a Tuesday afternoon in late August, riding slowly and alone, and Samuel met him at the fence post and knew from his face before he spoke that the news was not good. Gerald had been diagnosed in Laramie, where he had gone for a persistent difficulty with his breathing, with a condition of the lungs that the doctor described in terms that amounted to irreversible and progressing. He was not, the doctor had told him, likely to see another summer in the condition he would need to be in to manage the store. Samuel brought him inside and made coffee, and sat with him while he told Hester, who received the news with the steady composure of a woman who had learned early that the world did not ask permission before changing your plans, and then gave her uncle a long, wordless embrace that communicated better than any available words what he meant to her. That evening, after Gerald had returned to town, Samuel and Hester sat on the porch together in the warm dark and talked it through. The store needed management. Gerald had no one else. The cabin was 11 miles out, which was manageable but would become less so as Hester's pregnancy progressed and eventually as they had a child to consider. There were practical questions, serious ones, and they were the kind of people who addressed practical questions directly. "We could move into town," Samuel said. "The store has a back room that could be expanded. There is land beside it that Gerald owns." Hester was quiet for a moment. "This is your home," she said. "This is our home," he said, "and we can build another one." She looked at him in the dark of the porch, and he could not see her expression clearly, but he could feel the shape of it, the particular quality of her regard. "You would do that," she said. "Leave the cabin." "I built the cabin because I needed something and it gave me what I needed," Samuel said. "What I need now is different." He paused. "Gerald needs someone. You need to be closer to town as the baby comes. Those are the facts." He looked out at the dark of the valley below them, the creek invisible in the night but audible, steady, and continuous. "The valley will still be here. We can ride out on Saturdays." Hester took his hand in the dark. "You are a better man than you give yourself credit for," she said. "You give me enough credit for both of us," he said, and she laughed, and the sound of her laughing in the warm dark of their porch, with the Wyoming night spread out around them and the creek running below and the stars pressing close overhead, was something he wanted to keep hearing for the rest of his life. They moved to Cold Fork in September of 1886. Samuel acquired the lot beside Gerald's store from Gerald himself at a fair price, and he began building in the same methodical way he had built the original cabin, with timber and stone, and the kind of deliberate craftsmanship that reflected his belief that a thing worth having was worth building properly. He worked through the fall, and several men from the town came to help over 2 consecutive weekends, which was a thing that happened in small western towns when a family was known and respected, people simply appearing with tools and the understanding that the work was the occasion. Samuel found that he did not mind the help. He worked alongside men he was beginning to know, in the way of a man who is re-entering a community rather than withdrawing from one, and he found that the conversations over shared work were different from the social conversations he had always found draining. Work talk was purposeful, concrete, and left room for silence in a way that purely social conversation did not. Gerald Caldwell watched the construction from his store window and from his porch when the weather allowed, and his breathing was labored but his eyes were sharp and pleased in the way of a man who is watching things work out in a way he had hoped but not been certain to see. The house was framed and roofed before the first real snow of 1886. Samuel and Hester moved in November, into rooms that smelled of fresh-cut timber and linseed oil, and the particular new house scent that would become, over the years, entirely their own. Hester's time came in January of 1887. The midwife, a capable and unsentimental woman named Mrs. Cord, who had attended most of the births in Cold Fork for the past decade, arrived in the afternoon of the 10th and did not leave until the early hours of the 11th. And in between those arrivals and departures, Samuel Turner did the hardest waiting of his life. He was not allowed in, which was the custom, and which he accepted while being entirely unable to sit down. He stood on the porch in the January cold without feeling it, went inside, stood in the kitchen, went outside again, and repeated this circuit for hours while the sounds from the back room moved between ordinary and alarming and back again. And Mrs. Tanner, who had come with Mrs. Cord, appeared periodically in the doorway to tell him things were progressing normally, and he nodded and went back outside and stood in the cold and argued with the universe. At 3 in the morning, a cry arrived that was different from all the other sounds that had preceded it, new and absolute and irreplaceable, and Samuel stopped in the middle of the porch with his hand on the post and felt something happen inside him that he did not have a name for and did not need one. Mrs. Cord opened the door. "A boy," she said. "Healthy. Your wife is tired but well." He went in. Hester was propped against the pillows with her dark hair loose and damp, and her face wearing the particular expression of someone who has accomplished something enormous and is still feeling the edges of it. She was holding a small bundle that was their son, and when Samuel came through the door she looked up at him with those brown eyes, and they were bright, not tearful exactly, but lit from somewhere very deep. He sat on the edge of the bed. She put the bundle into his arms. He held his son. He had been afraid of this moment. In the quiet way, he had been afraid of most things that mattered, afraid that the memory of what had been lost before would overlay this and make it impossible to feel simply and completely. But the thing he felt when he held his son was not complicated at all. It was the simplest feeling he had ever had, clean and absolute, like the first cold water from a spring, and under it was the grief for what had been lost, but the grief was where it should be now, part of the foundation rather than the whole structure, something that had made him who he was rather than something that was all he was. "Thomas," Hester said, watching him. They had discussed names. Thomas had been agreed on. "Thomas Turner," Samuel said, to the small face that was the most remarkable thing he had ever seen, in a voice that was not entirely steady. Thomas Turner opened his eyes and regarded his father with the solemn, unfocused attention of a person who had just arrived somewhere very interesting and was not yet sure what to make of it. Gerald Caldwell met his great-nephew on the second day and sat with him for a long time with an expression that had nothing to do with his illness and everything to do with the fact that the future was here, small and absolute and doing fine. The months that followed were the kind of full that Samuel had spent years avoiding and now found that he had simply been wrong about. He had believed that full meant noisy and overwhelming, that other people's needs would crowd out his own, that the solitude he had built his life around was the only container adequate to hold who he was. He had been wrong. The noise was also music. The needs of his son were not a diminishment but an expansion, a daily reminder that the world was larger than his own interior life, which was a thing he had known intellectually and now knew in his hands and his sleep-deprived bones, and the particular quality of joy that arrived when Thomas first smiled at him. A gummy, unambiguous smile that communicated with total accuracy that Samuel Turner was the best thing he had ever seen. Gerald's health declined through the winter of 1887. He had good days and difficult days, and on the good days he was at the store, and in the community he had been part of for 15 years, and on the difficult days he rested, and Hester managed the store, and Samuel managed the house, and Thomas managed to grow at a pace that seemed designed to outpace their ability to track it. In the spring of 1887, Gerald called Samuel to his room on a good day, and they talked for 2 hours about the store and its accounts and the future of it, and it was the kind of conversation between men that does not require more words than it uses, because both parties understand what is being said. Gerald wanted to know the store would survive him. Samuel told him it would. Gerald wanted to know Hester would have what she needed. Samuel told him he would see to it every day for the rest of his life, and said it in the way that meant it could be taken as given. Gerald died in the early summer of 1887, on a morning in June when the air smelled of wildflowers, and the creek was running full with snowmelt. And he died quietly in his room above the store, and Hester was with him, and she came out afterward and stood on the porch of their new house with her arms around herself. And Samuel came and stood beside her and put his arm around her, and she leaned into him with the full weight of her grief, and he held her. The way she had held his grief in the parlor light of the boarding house in the middle of winter, without trying to diminish it or resolve it, simply present with it. She cried once thoroughly, and then she was done in the way she was done with things when she had felt them completely. She wiped her face and looked out at the June morning and said, "He was a good man." "He was," Samuel said. "He was glad you came," she said. "He told me once that he had hoped you would come to the boarding house that day. He said he could tell from the way you had been coming into the store all autumn." Samuel looked at her. "He was matchmaking. He was managing things," Hester said, and for the first time that morning she almost smiled. "It runs in the family." They buried Gerald on the hill east of town, beside his wife who had died 10 years before, and the whole town came, because Cold Fork was that kind of town and Gerald Caldwell had been that kind of man. Samuel stood beside Hester through the service with Thomas on his hip, and Thomas was old enough now to be curious about things, and spent most of the service examining his father's ear with serious scientific attention, which did not help with Samuel's composure, but helped with everything else. The store passed to Hester, as Gerald had arranged, and she took over its full management with the thoroughness she brought to everything, reorganizing the accounts and updating the inventory, and establishing 2 new supplier relationships that improved the store's margins in the first 6 months, by a percentage that made the other merchants in town take her seriously, in a way they had been slow to do. Because she was a woman and this was 1887, and the frontier was not exempt from that particular limitation, though it was somewhat more flexible about it than the places she had come from. Hester was not interested in flexibility. She was interested in the work, and she did it so well that flexibility became irrelevant. Samuel worked the store alongside her, and managed the building and the yard and the supply runs, and the occasional commission carpentry work that had begun to come his way from neighboring ranchers who had heard that he built things well. He was content in a way he had not known it was possible to be content, the contentment of a life that was full and known and chosen, every part of it. In the autumn of 1888, Hester told him she was expecting again. He received this news with considerably more ease than the first time, though the edge of old fear was there, present and honest, and he told her so, and she nodded and said she knew and reached across the kitchen table and put her hand over his, the same gesture he had made to her 2.5 years before when their positions were reversed. "We know how this goes now," she said. "We know we can do it." "We do," he said. The second child was born in June of 1889, a girl this time, and they named her Clara. Hester had suggested the name herself, sitting up in bed on the evening after the birth with their daughter asleep in the crook of her arm and Thomas, now 2.5 and taking up considerable space in the world, asleep in the adjacent room. "Clara," she had said simply, watching Samuel's face when she said it. He had been very still for a moment. Then, "You do not have to do that." "I know," Hester said. "I want to. She deserves to be remembered in something living." She looked down at their daughter's face, "And I think Clara Turner sounds exactly right." He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the daughter who had the dark hair of her mother and the long fingers of his own grandmother and the particular combination of both of their stubbornnesses that was going to be a force to reckon with in approximately 12 years, and he felt the past and the present occupy the same space without conflict, the way the grief had settled into the foundation, load-bearing rather than crushing. "Clara Turner," he said. "Yes, it does." Thomas, upon being introduced to his sister the following morning, regarded her with the same solemn scientific attention he had once directed at his father's ear, and then announced that she was very small and could she please be bigger, because he wanted someone to play with. Samuel and Hester laughed at this in the way of parents who will laugh at the same memory for 30 years. Cold Fork grew around them through the years that followed, adding a proper schoolhouse in 1890, a doctor's office in 1891, and a second general store run by a man from Kansas City who was not competition so much as confirmation that the town was worth competing for. The railroad came through 30 miles south in 1892, which changed the supply routes and the timelines and the prices of nearly everything, and Hester adapted the store's operations accordingly, because adapting was what she did, and did well. Thomas started school in 1893 and took to it with a fierceness that suggested he had inherited his mother's relationship with knowledge, which was that it was available and he intended to have it. Clara started school in 1895 and took a different approach, which was to learn everything required, and then everything beyond that, and then require explanations for everything that did not add up, which put her on excellent terms with her teacher and somewhat more complicated terms with her classmates. Samuel watched his children from the porch of the house he had built, and the watching was one of the primary occupations of his days. Not idle watching, but the active kind, the watching that was also listening and knowing, that built over years into a complete and irreplaceable understanding of another person. He watched Thomas become someone who was tall and direct, and had his mother's precision and his father's patience, a combination that was going to serve him well. He watched Clara become someone who was his grandmother's stubbornness and Hester's intelligence and her own particular fire, and he thought, watching her, that the world was not going to be able to disregard Clara Turner even if it tried. He told Hester this one evening on the porch, the two of them sitting in the chairs that had always been theirs, the wide Wyoming evening spreading out before them, the children inside doing their homework by lamplight. "Clara will be all right," Hester said, without hesitation. "I know she will," Samuel said. "I'm not worried about Clara. I am saying she is going to give someone a very interesting life." "She has already given us one," Hester said, and he heard the warmth in her voice, the full, unguarded warmth she saved for the moments when they were alone on the porch and the world had stepped back for a moment. He reached across and took her hand, the way he had been taking her hand since that first winter, the gesture so familiar now that it required no intention, simply arrived when it was wanted. "I was wrong about the alone," he said. It was not a new thing to say between them. He had said versions of it before, and she had heard versions of it, and it never stopped being true enough to say. "You were not wrong for the time it was," Hester said with her characteristic precision. "You were wrong for keeping it past its time. You told me that on the porch," he said, "the day I finally said something. I told you it felt like a waste," she said. "I am glad you could not argue with it." "I tried," he said. "You did try," she agreed. "Badly." He smiled, which was something he did easily now, a thing that had come back to him over the years of this life, the way that capability comes back to a muscle that has been given the right kind of use. He looked out at the evening, at the particular golden hour that Laramie County, Wyoming, put on display every autumn as if to remind you that beauty was a serious business out here. And he thought about the November morning 11 years before when he had walked into a general store expecting a solitary transaction and found a woman arguing with a ledger. He thought about the 6 weeks he had waited before going back, and the 3 days without coffee that he had earned by waiting. He thought about the parlor and the chairs and the winter light and the roof he had fixed in a blizzard. He thought about Clara and the wildflowers in the tin cup and the flat rock above the creek, and the way she had said yes before he had finished making himself clear. He thought about all of it, the whole construction of the life they had built the way he built everything, piece by piece and with intention, and he found that it held. It held the weight of grief and the weight of love and the weight of two children doing their homework by lamplight inside, and the weight of a town that had grown up around them, and the weight of all the years that had gone before, and all the years that were still to come. It held because he had not built it alone. Inside, Thomas called out a question about a geography assignment, and Clara immediately disputed whatever he had said, and Hester squeezed Samuel's hand once, and then stood up with the easy motion of a woman entirely at home in her life, and went inside to adjudicate. Samuel sat alone on the porch for a moment and listened to the voices inside, his wife's and his children's, the particular music of them, and then the screen door opened and Clara appeared, 8 years old and already carrying herself like someone with a point to make. "Papa," she said, "Thomas says the Missouri River runs north, but it runs south and east. Tell him." "The Missouri River," Samuel said, "runs generally south and east, yes." "I knew it," Clara said, with immense satisfaction, and disappeared back inside. Samuel Turner sat on his porch in the last of the Wyoming evening and listened to his family and looked at the darkening sky and thought that a man who had chosen to spend his years alone, had made a whole elaborate philosophy of it, had counted the solitary days with something close to pride, could be very comprehensively wrong about what he needed without any dishonor in the wrongness. The wrongness was only in the staying wrong. He had not stayed wrong. Or rather, he had stayed wrong until someone had looked at him with Creekwater eyes and told him, without apology or negotiation, that it seemed like a waste, and he had not been able to argue with that. He had tried, briefly and badly, as Hester had accurately noted. He had failed at the arguing and succeeded at everything else. The door opened, and Hester came back out, carrying 2 cups of coffee, and she handed him one and sat in her chair, and the warmth of the coffee and the warmth of her presence and the warmth of the lamplight coming through the windows of their house reached him at the same time, all 3 of them converging in the exact same moment, and he thought that was perhaps the most accurate description of what his life was now. Warmth from 3 directions at once. No cold patches. No carefully maintained empty spaces. Just this. He drank his coffee and looked at his wife in the last of the evening light, the ring he had given her on the flat rock above the creek catching the glow from the windows, and she looked back at him with those eyes that had never stopped being direct and never stopped being warm, the combination that had undone him from the first day. And she said nothing because she did not need to, and he said nothing because he did not need to either, and the night came in quietly around the house he had built for them. And inside their children argued about geography, with the passionate certainty of people who have never doubted that the world was worth arguing about. Samuel Turner had spent years alone on purpose. He had built the aloneness carefully and maintained it well and believed in it the way a man believes in something that has cost him enough to feel like a conviction. And then Hester Cooper had made alone feel like a waste. He could not argue with that. He had tried, and he was so grateful he had failed.